Okay, good morning, everybody. Some of you have met me before yesterday, but my name is Cameron, and I'm from Axis, and I'm going to be talking to you today about a series of cinematics that we made for Wild Rift with Unreal Engine. So first, a little bit of background on the studio. I work for Axis Studios. We're based in the UK. We have two studios in Glasgow and in Bristol, along with a fully worldwide team of artists working remotely, mainly in Europe and some even further afield. In fact, the project we're talking about today was made with a fully remote team, which is, I guess, just an example of the fact that we, embrace the remote working life. Our headquarters is located, as you can see above, in Sky Park in Glasgow, which is prone to some beautiful sunsets. I couldn't help but include this picture. Axis prides itself in the variety of work we produce. We work on both long form and short form content, from hyper-realistic work, VFX work, to very stylized work. So today, I'm going to be talking about a very stylized project, and before I get into it, I think I'm just going to play our stylized reel just to give you an idea of the kind of work we produce.
For your service.
Want to go cause a ruckus?
It's like a kind of door opens up out there to some other world.
Bloody hell! That's good.
So yeah, that's the kind of work we do. So a little bit background on me. As I said, my name's Cameron. I'm a real-time supervisor at Axis. My general job involves overseeing a project, making sure it hits the creative bar that we're aiming for, while ensuring it stays on time and on schedule, working along with the production director and art director. I like to get quite involved, especially on real-time projects, because that's where my background is. I like getting hands-on and helping things run smoothly. I've been working in the industry now for about 7 years, and in fact, I've been at Axis all of that time. In fact, I was involved with them even before officially being in the industry. Axis does a mentorship program with local Scottish universities, where applicants can send in a piece that they make, and in certain cases get mentored by someone in the studio. So I was fortunate enough to be included in that, and I was partnered up with someone who would give me feedback. I would get to come in and visit the studio. And then after I graduated, I joined as a junior environment artist. And around that time, Axis was getting involved with some more real-time work, which interested me because my background was, as a student, I figured that Unreal was a way to get nice-looking renders when you have not the best computer and don't have access to a render farm. So I jumped over to Unreal. I became a lighter and compositor, worked on a bunch of real-time projects, and worked up to where I am today as a real-time supervisor. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the projects I supervised, which it was codenamed Mini. So what is Mini? Well, Axis has a long history of collaboration with Riot, who make League of Legends. We've worked with them for several years on various different cutscenes and trailers for games, hero announces, and different events in game. We lean towards more stylized work with them, and today's project was the latest in the series of collaborations that we've had with Riot. So Mini was a series of 4 character trailers that we made to introduce heroes coming over to Wild Rift, which is the mobile version of League of Legends. Again, Mini might seem like a random name to you, but I've been calling it that over like a year of producing this, so it's a little bit of a conditioned response in me by now. So when I say Mini, it means this project. So a few base facts about the project. We were working generally on a much shorter time frame for these episodes than other projects at Axis. Generally, when we're doing a project, we have anywhere from 6 months, 11 months, longer, really depending on the scope of work. On this one, we had about 12 weeks per episode, running one at a time with a small overlap of 2 or 3 weeks. So that's generally quite mini, you could say, by our standard scale. We also had a very small core team. We had literally 1 environment artist, 1 lighting artist, 1 DMP artist. So we also had a very compact team. The scope for this show was designed to be smaller and a little more contained than our previous work for Riot. And those 3 sort of aspects are what make this mini. It was designed to be these mini cines made by like a small, flexible team, creating these trailers in quite a short time frame in terms of like much smaller scale than our previous work for Riot. So the challenge for us was then to take that and find a style for these trailers that would tie in with the game and our previous work, but doing that in Unreal. So before I talk any more about the project, I'm just going to play one of the episodes we made. So that gives you an idea of what we're working with here. So before I go any further, where does Realtime come into this, and why are we even doing this on Unreal? So firstly, Riot had already created some trailers internally with their team to promote Wild Rift, and they'd use Unreal on their trailers, so it made sense from us from that point to just try and continue that pattern and keep a coherence in these series of trailers to promote the game. Secondly, from a creative viewpoint, it made sense for us to do this in real time because we were working directly with the characters from game. We were getting delivered the assets that are designed to work on mobile, taking that and making a trailer with it. By bringing that in Unreal, hopefully we would be able to let those assets shine in the best light rather than trying to throw it into a pre-rendered pipeline and make them something that they're not. Thirdly, using Unreal as a render replacement in the studio meant that we could be more flexible and have a faster turnaround to be able to iterate and add more value into this project, considering we're working on a relatively small time frame. And then lastly, we've done a lot of work in Axis with Realtime, but that's largely in terms of in-game cinematics and trailers where Unreal's a render replacement. This was the first time we'd done any kind of episodic work, so it was a new opportunity for us to sort of start looking into that and use it as the first step towards taking on bigger episodic or long-form content where we were using Unreal. So now that we understand the base facts of what this project is, I'm going to take a look today at some aspects of how we brought this show together. So first I'm going to talk about how we approached the style and found that. Then I'm going to talk about our general approach to asset work on the show. Then I'm going to move on to talking about projections, which were a big part of achieving this look. Then I'm going to talk a little about our animation pipeline and tools we use to move data across to Unreal. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little about the render and review process for the show. So, first thing, how did we find the style for this show? League of Legends, across all of its media, has a very polished and defined style. Whether it's been done by one studio or another in one style, from realistic to in-game to trailers by various different studios, it's always recognizable as League of Legends. Despite the interpretation, you know where it's coming from, and you know what game it's, what game universe it's originating from. So when we started Mini, we had the question of how are we going to interpret that look in our trailers, and where are we going to fit in that sort of universe of styles. So before we started working on the full show, we did this early vertical slice. This was just to give us an idea of what we were working with, using some of the original assumed scope of the show, working with the mobile character. And then we used a lot of 2D DMP layers, and then a simple 3D environment before bringing the character over, adding some effects and simple cameras. So this as a starting point was great because it gave us a baseline of what we could achieve with the show within the scope we had, and then it gave us a baseline that we could use to take our style further as we moved into the full production of our episodes. So when we were approaching this style, we knew there was a few key driving factors that were going to help us arrive at the look. So firstly, we knew we wanted to be authentic to the game world. So League of Legends is set in Runeterra, and this world is very bold, it's very colorful. It focuses a lot on hand-painted textures, which are at the forefront of the look. Wild Rift, being on mobile, pushes that a little further due to its target hardware, with the style being simplified a little more. Everything's been made a little more readable due to it being presented on a mobile screen. That was something we wanted to bring over in our cinematics to help tie it into the game. Secondly, a key point for us was that we were working directly with the game models. As I mentioned, we were taking the mobile quality assets and bringing them into our cutscenes. We knew that that was a core pillar of what we were working with on the show, and by leaning into that, we wanted to turn this into a strength of the project and build our style around these models, rather than trying to turn these models into something they're not, or set them against assets that wouldn't tie in and be coherent with them. And lastly, we knew that we needed a style that was going to be flexible and doable within the time frame we had. We wanted to emphasize iteration and creativity and be able to make direction changes on a show within the time that we had, and not be bogged down with a slow style that was very difficult to steer if we needed to change direction partway through the episode. So if you imagine a style of scale with complexity moving from left over to the right, on the left, yeah, that is the left, you have the most stylized form, which is literally in-game. Everything's very bold, everything's readable. And then on the right, you have like very high-end, high-budget, complex CG stylized realism trailers. We knew we weren't going to be on either end of that spectrum, and I think we found that we were going to be ultimately somewhere in the middle, which was between the in-game work and between the previous high-end stylized work that we'd done at Axis, which is, not realism, but stylized. So if you zoom in on that scale, we wanted to try and have the best of both worlds in our piece. We wanted to be true to the nature of the game, because we were using those characters and feel connected to it, bringing across that 3D feel that the game has, and bringing across the tone, but then also trying to elevate that and push the trailers closer to the previous work we'd done, bringing over some of the artistic elements like the color palettes and the strong use of room lighting and the slightly flatter, more 2D look, and blend these two together so that we could hopefully be coherent to both our library of work and to the larger world of the trailers for League. So ultimately, the style we settled on focused on a really strong use of color. We had a defined palette that established the tone of each episode, and we also chose to lean into like a very strong dynamic range in our images. We didn't want to be afraid to let things fall down to very dark levels and let things live in shadow, because firstly, that created a compelling image. It was dynamic and it was bold, but also it lets the viewer just focus on the story, and it doesn't draw people's attention towards the nature of the assets. If you have a very light and a very flat style, people are going to be more inclined to not look at the story, but instead do an asset review, which is not what we want. We want people to just be focused on the experience. So in practice, this gave us a style that was really straightforward to work with in Unreal. We didn't need much global illumination or bounce lighting. We were able to use fully ray traced lighting in Unreal, which saved us any need for baking things. And that made changing the direction of a shot very easily. So here you can see I did like a relight of one of our shots over the course of about 5 minutes, and I've just sped it up here. But we, if needed to, could change essentially what the shot was going to look like and have something for review within the same day or the next day, which for us was very beneficial. It also had the benefit of being extremely fast to render. We could render the whole show in under an hour, which meant that each day we'd be able to have the whole episode for review, which meant that everyone knew where the show was going, how it was looking. So that was our general approach to finding the style. And now that we had that, it was a matter of taking that and building that through our assets and projections. So now we're moving on to the asset work. And as we found out during production, a large part of our process for this show came from the selective repurposing of assets, which I like to call giving them like a second life, a creative second life. This wasn't something we initially assumed we'd be doing for the project. The original scope was that we'd be taking the game models, taking a DMP background and just working with that and having something very contained. But we discovered quite quickly that there was a lot of opportunities to bring in assets and elements from other trailers, which lets us add a lot of value and scope to the project in a very efficient way, which let us push these storytelling opportunities further than we'd initially anticipated. So on our first episode, we had a script that called for a boat at night. And we realized quickly that we had a model that was already quite close to that from a previous trailer that we'd done. So in the top corner, you can see the Ruined King trailer, which we'd made previously. So we had this boat model, and it was very close. So we took that, we did some simple modification in 3D, and within days, we had ourselves an environment much faster than we'd anticipated, which had an impact on the show from very early on. Because we had a much more complex 3D environment, our storytelling opportunities widened, and we were able to do a lot more 3D cameras, as you can see in the bottom, than would have been able to do if we were very DMP bound, because if you're very DMP bound, your cameras have to be fairly locked off, and making a camera move or making a camera sort of turn a lot can be very prohibitive, because that obviously involves more projections. So this way of working already changed the way we approached the project, just because we were able to give this boat a second life with some simple modification. So then moving on to our next episode, which was the Samira episode we just watched, we knew we were going to have a battle in some desert. So we started with some rough sketches of where that could be. We had ideas of burned trees, ruins, maybe rock pillars, and then we set about looking in our old projects to see if there was anything that could give us a head start there. So we took the same approach as we had on the first episode and found something in one of our previous works. So from one of our old Tales of Runeterra episodes, we had this ice environment, which you can see over here, which was used as a projection base. And we found these massive rock structures that you don't really even see in the episode that we could then take and use as a base for the environment in our Wild Rift episode, which again gave us a massive head start, let us focus on other areas of the show rather than having to resculpt rocks, and gave these poor cold rocks a second life in a nice desert. So that approach was not just limited to the environment. We did realize quite quickly that we would also be able to incorporate character assets from other trailers, which would let us add to our storytelling opportunities. Because due to our original project scope, we didn't have a dedicated character artist full-time with us. So where we could find other characters from trailers and bring them into our project, it let us add value in a very efficient way and make the project greater than it would have been otherwise. So as you can see from this slide, we have characters from previous Axis projects, Fortitia's work, and Blur trailers, now all living together in the Wild Rift cinematics. Now, of course, having Riot as a partner here was extremely beneficial, because we not only our own projects we were able to use as a source of bringing assets in, but Riot was very collaborative and would let us work with them and their partner studios to bring in assets to help us expand our scope. So when we did incorporate characters, we wanted to try and make sure there was a good reason for why they were showing up. So for example, in the cinematic we watched earlier, this guard was in a previously seen Axis cinematic, which is on the left here, where they are resisting an invasion by Noxus. And it is plausible that within this world, after they then get defeated, those soldiers scatter to the desert, only to then be taken out by Samira and Scion, who work for Noxus. So by making sure the repurposing of those characters made sense in a sort of lore and a logical way, it added, again, extra storytelling value to these episodes and tried to tie these cinematics together in a loose referential way. Now, of course, bringing in assets from various different projects with, as I mentioned, Riot's different styles across all their trailers, it was not just a matter of take the asset in, drop it, and expect it to work. We did need to make sure that these assets still felt consistent against each other and were coherent with our style. So in practice, to make sure things felt unified, we made some adjustments to asset textures to bring them to the same level and make sure they felt okay against each other. We tried not to modify the geometry too much due to our project's sort of time frame. Rigging was happening almost in parallel to when we were working on the models, so we didn't want to make too many geometry changes because that was going to upset the rigging pipeline. So a lot of our style modification came through textures, which are very easy to implement later because that doesn't cause any knock-on to rigging. In terms of unifying the environments, that was largely achieved through projection, which I'll be talking about briefly. So in cases... Okay, one sec, I might need to just relaunch the PowerPoint there. Hey, there we are. In cases where we had something that the script needed that we didn't have a character we could just bring over, we did still use the same sort of philosophy of approach for this. So we needed, for the first episode, we needed this deckhand to work on a ship. We didn't have a model that would work for that, but we still were able to find an asset to use as a starting point. So we took this Ionia boy that we'd used on a previous previous Runeterra episode, modified that with some character work, and then again we had this asset that we could reuse, that still had some efficiency of work because we were able to use our old model as a starting point. So this was still a way where we could draw upon our library of work and expand the scope, but not have to put a full amount of time into character creation, which with our time frame and our team size was a massive help for us. So the idea of expanding scope and efficiencies doesn't just apply to other projects coming into R1, this also applies within the project cumulatively. So every time we bring an asset into Unreal, every prop, every character and every effects, once you've set that up, that can then be used for essentially with no extra time on a future project because you've already done the work. So in the case of this effect that you can see here, we set this up for the dust kick-ups in episode 2, and then we were able to reuse these in episode 4 because we had the effect ready to go. It just needed some shot implementation. So the benefit of this is on a project like this that's episodic, the more episodes you do, the more savings you will get cumulatively because you've done the work, the initial creation has been done, and then that asset is essentially living in your library. So that was our approach across all of the episodes. Wherever we could, we would search across our previous cinematics, partner studios cinematics, and see what we could take into Mini to expand our scope, give things a second life, and try and push our storytelling opportunities. Of course, as I mentioned, having Riot and their partner studios was extremely beneficial here because that gave us a much larger library that we could draw upon, and we're very lucky that you get to work in such a collaborative environment where you have that access, because obviously this doesn't apply to everyone. If you were just starting from scratch, you wouldn't necessarily be able to make all of these benefits. You would, however, get the cumulative benefits of, as each episode goes on, you have these savings. So, as I mentioned before, this let us push our storytelling much more than we'd initially assumed, and also by reusing these characters, it also let us try to tie these cinematics into the larger world of League of Legends and tie things into the lore, which I think was quite satisfying for us. So now that we've covered the assets, I'd like to talk a little bit about our work on projections for the show. So we knew from the start that projections were going to be a huge part of this look. Projections, map paintings are used extensively in stylized work axis, in particular previous Riot work. Now, map paintings, for anyone that might not know, is essentially just an image applied to a plane, whereas a projection is an image projected over 3D geometry. Now, map paintings are easy to do in Unreal. You just add an image to a plane, set it in your scene. Projections, however, was a little bit of a challenge because we'd not previously done that inside of Unreal. So we needed to make something for this project that would have the same functionality that we'd used on previous pre-rendered projects, and we needed to make sure that it would be easy to hand over to an artist that isn't familiar with the engine that could then work. It needed to be easy for us to take back into Unreal and integrate, and it also needed to be non-disruptive to like the other people working on the project, because when you have a smaller time frame, we don't want to be waiting for DMPs to come in to move forward. It needed to be able to work in parallel with the other departments. So the solution to this, essentially creating a blueprint, would give us basic functionality of a projection. So for anyone not familiar with Unreal, blueprint is essentially a little tool that lets you do some visual scripting. So for someone like me that doesn't code, you can make tools, which is a very powerful part of Unreal's workflow. So our projection blueprint is essentially a camera that takes a texture and projects it based on its field of view, and then it projects that via a decal. Now, a decal in Unreal is essentially like a sticker that gets applied back onto the scene, and that sticker can be blended in several different ways. You can have that sticker applied after lighting or before lighting, or you can apply that sticker to just different texture passes. So it's essentially like doing some form of in-camera compositing in Unreal to try and explain it in a pre-rendered sense. So in practice, this tool, we could just drag it into a scene, and then you have your projection. Then you need to essentially choose your projection angle, which is what I'm doing here. So what I'm doing is I'm moving the projection to the shot camera in this sense. So now you have your projection, and as you can see in the top corner, the projection lives in this box. That's your projection bounds, which is essentially where the image is the projection is being thrown out onto the 3D scene. So we essentially set that up for an angle, and then when that's done, essentially the next step is to just capture that image, and then you send that to the texture painting artist. Then they make some beautiful art, which this definitely is not, but it proves the point. So then you save that image out and bring it back into Unreal as a texture, and then you project it back through the camera, and you have your projection working. So in practice, it's very straightforward. Now, when you do pop out of the camera, however, you have certain downsides. You see the texture spilling here. This is easily worked around because in Unreal, you can key which objects will receive a decal or projection, and the projection itself can be toggled on and off per shot. So we were doing that a lot in our episodes of essentially taking a shot projection and choosing which objects are receiving it, and on a shot-by-shot basis, changing what projections are and aren't visible. So the workflow for it is essentially we take the original shot, capture the projection angle, then I capture the render passes. So we would generally capture the base color, occlusion, normal, scene depth, just so that the texture artist has that information to work with. Then they make the nice overpaint, and then we project it back through the camera. So now that we had that workflow, we used it extensively across our episodes. We would largely modify the environments with that. You generally don't want to project on characters because they're moving so much. Projections and motion are not very good friends. So now that we had that workflow, it let us be very flexible, because now we could send something off to our texture artists who we'd worked with on previous League of Legends work. They know the style, but they're not familiar with Unreal. So being able to just give them an image and say, make it pretty, was very beneficial for us. And the way that these decals work was great for those of us working in Engine, because most of the time what we were doing was essentially modifying the asset's textures. We weren't really modifying the final image, so we could still work on top of this non-destructively. Effects and environments could still work on top of this. Because the projections were essentially living as a layer in the scene, it meant that it wasn't anything that was a blocker for us, which again, in our time frame of the episode was great. Now, of course, projections do have some drawbacks that we need to take into consideration. Now, firstly, the video kind of demonstrates it, but parallax is a problem, not just for this project, but for projections in general. If you have a projection camera and a shot camera and they're moving independently of each other and you have objects in depth, you're going to have problems because projections are essentially very camera dependent. Now, the workaround to that is you start splitting your scene up in Z depth. You have different projections for different depth layers. The downside to that, it becomes more file management. You have to make more projection setups. The projection artist has to work in more files, and the more of those you have, the less happy everyone is. Secondly, this was a fairly manual process because we hadn't done this before. It was very hands-on. I would set up the projection blueprint, I'd capture the files, put it into a Photoshop document, send it to the artist, they'd send it back to me. It worked for the scope of work we were doing here because we were a fairly small project, but on a bigger project, I think you'd want to automate this a little bit. And lastly, size limitations are a factor. Not so much for what Unreal can handle. It can take a 16K image and magically deal with that. But for the texture artist, if you go above 4K to 8K, your Photoshop starts to get progressively slower and slower. And that, again, does not make a happy texture artist. So in some cases, we needed to split the projections up into chunks, but then you have the same problem of more file management. So it's about finding that balance. You have to be tactical with where you place projections, which was, I think, thinking of where to place them is the biggest setup step. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little now about our animation workflow. So going from Maya to Unreal. So in terms of this chapter, I'm just going to cover why we approached animation the way we did. Then I'm going to talk a little about our tools and our export and import pipeline. And then I'm going to talk about some of the benefits we had for doing our animation, like going to Unreal and visualizing it there. So just a little bit of background on the animation sort of method. So for most projects in Axis, we use Alembic caches. So for anyone that isn't aware, that's essentially you're baking your file out to this, you're baking the file out in a very controlled way. Everything is baked down and put out to a file that then gets read in by another program, and you're essentially freezing all of that information into a file. Now, that's how we work on most of our projects at Axis. We have a lot of pipeline support for that. We have a lot of knowledge for that within the studio. However, over in Realtime, we generally use something called the skeletal animation workflow. That's a little different. Instead of baking the whole file, you just bake the skeleton data, which then gets brought over into Unreal and read by the version of the rig in Unreal. We use that because it's the standard way that games work, which is what our real-time work has generally been in the past, and that's what we have more pipeline support for in the real-time department. It's a little lighter to deal with than caches, and it also has some benefits of bringing across some data that we can then use in downstream departments in Unreal, which I'll cover at the end of this chapter. So in terms of managing that data, when it comes to getting the information from Maya, we use our real-time exporter. This tool is very light and straightforward to use. You essentially open it in a scene and it will read your list of rigs from the reference editor. It will read your camera from the camera sequencer, which also derives the shot duration. And this ensures that we always have consistent export locations for where people put their shots. And if a shot ever breaks, this tool can diagnose some of the common causes. Like if you have like two joints with the same name, it'll give you a clue as to where your shot's broken, which again, very beneficial when you're needing to export something and you don't have a lot of time. Then over in Unreal, we have our importer, which then displays all of that exported data and then lets you do a one-click export and shot build, which is the biggest time saver for us in Unreal. It takes all of that information and builds a shot around it and ensures that the shot duration matches what we have in the Maya file, and it will also manage the full scene edit. It'll read all of that shot length and build you your full timeline so that with one click, artists can have parity with what we have in the Maya scenes. In the background, all of this data is managed by these configuration files. So we had one file for each shot, which essentially lists the manifest of data. So you have every actor in there, you have its export and import status tracked, you have additional check flags for whether that asset has blend shapes, whether that asset is no longer visible. So that is what helps Unreal know what is going on in the Maya file and whether there's something changed. And in practice, this is very straightforward. So you have a Maya file, you make sure you've got your actor selected for export, you add a description there for the version, and then over in Unreal, you open up the importer, you find your shot, and you can investigate your imported data, but then you hit the one-click import and shot build, and that'll import all of the FBX data, put it on the rigs, and then build a shot around it. So it was very simple for us to take things from Maya over to Unreal. Yeah, so that was the process for exporting single shots. However, on this project, we needed a way to automate that because we were working with a partner studio for animation, which meant that we're delivering us Maya files. So it became a massive bottleneck if one of us were to open 30 Maya files and repeat that process. So by automating that, we created the batch exporter tool, which essentially does that process over lunchtime. It takes that JSON configuration file that I'd mentioned earlier. It reads all of that for every shot because once you've done layout on a show, you essentially know the sort of scope of what is in each shot. You know your shot names, you know what assets you have, and then that tool can read those JSON files and build essentially a recipe for a batch script, which then we would update, obviously, if assets change within a shot. But this was a massive time saver for us because we could receive all of these delivered files, hit the batch exporter, it would export all of that information, and then again, in Unreal, use the one-click import. It just makes the animation process so much smoother. And as a small additional note, I'll mention for anyone that is working for themselves and maybe doesn't have a pipeline support, the default game exporter in Maya is just as solid. We actually used it in production. In times when our tools ran into problems, we still needed a way to export data. So having the default game exporter was great because it exports the same stuff. It still works, and it meant we could move forward even when we were having some tools problems. It also helped us in certain cases. So for example, we had one issue where blend shapes weren't working because the rigging methodology was slightly different for this project. While we diagnosed that in our tools, we used the game exporter and it was working with the game exporter, so we were able to compare our results and see where our tool was going wrong, thanks to having that ability to sort of look and compare files. So moving over to like the generalization of why things are better when you're working with Unreal for animation, the biggest benefit for us was having the ability to essentially see your previs early in engine. So you can see here our final image and the render from when we were working on previs. Because we had those fast exports, essentially all of our layout and previs for the show was reviewed and delivered in engine. This is compared to how we work on a traditional show where we largely work on playblasts. So as you can see, there's quite a difference in terms of how you visualize that. You spend a lot of time when you're working with playblasts imagining how the work is going to look. You try and imagine, yeah, there's going to be lights. It's going to look pretty one day. And you kind of have to hope that it's all going to come together. So by being able to see things so early in the engine, it meant that we could see the tone of the episode reflected really early, which meant the director could see where things were going, the team could see where things were going, and we were all aligned on the steps we were taking on the show. This also let artists start working on elements like lighting, general lighting, and some effect setups much earlier than they would have been able to otherwise, because we were leveling up the Unreal scene bit by bit with animation that would just come in very regularly. So, no, I broke again. I need some elevator music for when I relaunch my slides. Here we go. So it also allowed us to preview things that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise if we weren't using the viewport in Unreal, because we had benefit of like depth of field and ray trace reflections. So in the case of this shot, we were able to rely on the ray traced reflections to use this shot where we were looking in a puddle and we were meant to see this guy on the mast behind us. So we were able to literally just aim the camera into this puddle, use the reflection and know, okay, this is going to hold up in the full shot. Otherwise, we would have had to set up this like second camera to fake a reflection so you can imagine how it's going to work. So These kinds of little unexpected benefits are where the beauty of Unreal's viewport comes in. You get these things for free, and it expand your be more confident in your cinematography much more early in the project. So in terms of other departments working with animation, because we had these shots available in Engine very early, it let us start iterating and building on these shots. And because of the way we managed our scene files in Unreal, we essentially had everything, every different department on layers and sub-levels so that they could work in parallel. You'd have lighting, environments, DMP, effects, all living as separate layers in the scene that would let artists work in parallel. Now this combined with the fact that we had essentially one person leading each department, that meant that if there was ever something in a shot that someone had questions on, they knew exactly who to talk to and they would be able to collaborate and build these shots up very quickly. Our team also had quite a bit of like generalist skill outside their core focuses. That also meant that if they saw something that wasn't working in a shot, like a light had broken or a texture was bugged, they would generally be able to pop into that file and make that change, which ensured that we had essentially very healthy shots from early on the show to the final, which meant that you were never really working with broken things, and we'd always have like a fairly good looking shot to review, which then let us iterate and focus on the creative rather than struggling just to get the shot in a good place. So as I mentioned earlier, one thing that was great about this pipeline was that we retain some of the access, some of the information from Maya over in Unreal. So because we were working with bone data, you can still access that rig information when you're in Engine, which lets us do things in lighting and effects, like as you see here, parenting a light to a bone, which then lets the bone drive the light, which lets you do sort of semi-procedural light setups here. We have lights attached to the end of her gun rather than having to hand key them, which again, if animation changes, it doesn't affect us in lighting versus having to go back and hand key it and spend a lot of time. So here you can see I've set up essentially an empty actor on her hip and then parented two lights to that, which lets you make essentially a light rig that will follow Samira as she runs around, which lets you make big changes to the lighting very quickly by just moving one thing. So that's where having that access to the bone data is great, because you can essentially let things, again, be driven by the animation, saving time, letting you make simple lighting setups that are, you know, flexible and iterative. So the benefits of this workflow really come down to the speed and the previews. By being able to see things early, you're able to make bolder changes and bolder decisions in like how you approach the cinematography, how you approach the look. You don't have to imagine shadows, you don't have to imagine reflections, you see them, and that then lets you make informed decisions in the layout and in the previs that you aren't always able to if you're kind of having to imagine where it's going to look. And in addition, because we were working with skeletal animation and game rigs, we had access to that bone data, which then let other departments benefit from it. And the rigs were very light, which meant they were quick to export and also fast for animators to work with in the Maya scene, which, again, animators will always be happy if the rigs are fast. So now moving on to our last section, I'm just going to briefly talk about how we worked with rendering on the show and how we reviewed and approved work. So at Axis, our main tool for review and organization is ShotGrid. That's where we have all of our previews and versions, and that's where we review and sign off work. It's a big part of our pipeline. So when it comes to getting files from Unreal, there's something called the Movie Render Queue, which is a great tool. It's what we use to render frames, and it's very versatile, very quick, and very flexible. But because we're working in a pipeline, we needed a way to make that a little more consistent and automated, which is where the Axis Submitter comes in. So that's essentially a tool that wraps around the Movie Render Queue and lets you automate your output location. It lets you automate render presets, which let you control the quality that the show is rendering across all artists. And it ensures that essentially for an artist, all you have to do is open this tool, select a shot, add a description, export. That will then render locally on your PC before moving the files over onto our network, which then gives our editorial department access to those frames that they can then take and make an episode edit. So once those frames are on the network, the tool then generates a MOV preview, which then gets uploaded to ShotGrid. So that's where work eventually goes to be then reviewed by directors and the team when we do creative reviews, which is no different to how we work on any other project at Axis. We have versions, and then we look at them, we give notes, and we basically go around until the shot is done. So the impact for us of rendering on Unreal is that our render times were a matter of seconds rather than minutes or hours as they can be in other shows, which was obviously a massive saving for us with our time frame for this episode. And in addition, because we were working in Engine, we didn't have a separate compositing stage, so that saved additional time in terms of exporting files, importing files, and then also rendering your comp. Because it was all done in camera, it meant that it was just one export. It took a matter of seconds or minutes for a shot. You would have the whole show rendered in. With our highest quality settings, the show would render in an hour or 2 hours. So it meant that in reality, we were not ever limited by render time. If a show ever got longer because we wanted to expand our camera angles or hold a shot, it was not a problem. It also meant that we could be, again, with the idea of iteration, very flexible. If we needed to make a change on our final afternoon, no problem. Generally, on a pre-rendered show, you do not want to do that. You try and lock things off in the last week. The last week is just final touches. You do not want to be messing with things. But for us, because it was a matter of minutes, seconds, sure, we can change this light. Why not? So to try and summarize everything I've just talked about, how did real-time change our approach? So the obvious thing when you think real-time is, yeah, it's faster. Like I just said, it renders quick. It is more than that. I think ultimately, when you're working with real-time, it brings you the ability to be much more flexible and much more iterative than you would if you were working on a pre-rendered pipeline. I think the good way to visualize it is when you're in a pre-rendered pipeline, everything is like, it's described as a waterfall. Every department's feeding into the next one, and things are done. You kind of lock into a decision. You have to hand it off to the next department. And sometimes if you want to make a change at the end, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And that combined with render times means you really need to plan these things and kind of commit to that plan. But for us in real time, because we were working in parallel with a very fast renderer, it was very easy for us to make changes and to not be afraid to swap these things around because it was flexible. So that let us be more creative as a result and sort of experiment a little more. And due to the fact that you can achieve a lot with Unreal, we're able to usually have smaller teams, which I think helps us be collaborative. Everyone on this project was, by the end of it, quite tight-knit. Everyone knew each other because, it was so small. You would just say, hey, environment artist, can you tweak this for me? And like it was very easy to sort of just talk to each other, make changes. It felt very to be honest, it reminded me a little bit more of when I was like working on like my student film, because we were like a little like family making this series of trailers. It was really nice. But I think that holds up on previous trailers, previous work I've done in real time. Just because you're all working in that sort of shared viewport space and you sort of see the final image, there's just this great feeling of collaboration that comes with it. So thinking towards the future, this was our last project that we made with Unreal 4 at Axis. When we started, Unreal 5 was not quite ready for production, so we stuck with that. But now that we're done, we're able to sort of take a breath and think where this could go in the future. Now, I'm sure some of you already know Unreal 5 is a thing. It looks amazing. And moving over to that new version of the engine gives us a chance to sort of look at where we can go in terms of real-time workflows in the future. Now, as you'll hopefully have gathered from this talk, real-time generally has a slightly different approach to the rest of the studio. We have to make slightly different workflow approaches. We have to make slightly different decisions in terms of our pipeline. Now, I think in the future, where real-time can really thrive is by being more integrated into studio pipelines and not so much of a different thing. And I think that can be achieved, hopefully, by universal scene description and Material X. So for anyone that isn't familiar, it's essentially, these are tools that move towards more of a render agnostic pipeline where data can move between Maya to Houdini to Unreal to Nuke without necessarily needing bespoke steps for each application. Now, having a pipeline built around that for us in real time could mean that shows are able to leverage Unreal much easier than they would have been able to otherwise. You could have a show that starts in Maya, moves to Unreal for previs if you want to get those reflections, if you want to get those nice previews and make that cinematography decisions, then you can carry that data back through and work on a pre-rendered show. Alternatively, you could have a pre-rendered show that decides to swap to Unreal halfway through production, but because you're using USD, that data is more transferable than it would have been otherwise. So that's something we're looking into. If it goes well, maybe I'll be here in a few years to talk about it, or one of my colleagues, I don't know. But yeah, on that note, I'll just say thank you all for coming and listening to me talk for 50 minutes. You can find us at booth E19. I mean, I've spoken to some of you already, but anyone that hasn't, please feel free to come and say hi. We're all friendly, we don't bite, and I'd love to chat to all of you. And if I can take the opportunity, if I can grab a picture of this just for Adele, yeah? If nobody minds, that is. No, I'll just grab it. Say cheese, everyone. Thank you. So we have 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. That's a good question. So I guess the way this project worked is we did layout and previs internally at Axis. So we were doing, because we had the engine on our side, we were doing all of our layout reviews in engine, and then we were sharing that with Riot and showing them where it was going. But we partnered with an animation studio for this, and they were working, they didn't have access to the engine, so they were delivering animation edits that were still playblasts, which works fine because you're still able to review stuff. We would, in parallel though, be delivering versions to Riot with effects and lighting, so they would still see it. We weren't doing official reviews from engine, but in any show where we were doing animation internally, yeah, we would use the engine because the data is quick enough to move over that it's worth it. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yes, that's a good question. So 100% UV's broke. Like it's a matter of thinking like where you want to where you want to break things and where you want to fix it really. So yes, by changing elements of the ship, UVs were broken, but we did fix them on areas where we were going to be like shooting, like around the deck where the cameras were. Yes, we needed to fix that. Under the ship, no, because it's under the water. You know, there was areas where we could let that not be a problem, but that's also where projections help. We didn't, because we knew we were going to be projecting on top of things, you can let some things not have good UV maps because the projections are not dependent on UVs, they're a projection after the fact. So that let you be tactical with where you needed to do that work. Hello.
Hello. It's working? Okay, good. Do you think this pipeline can work with realistic style, especially for VFX, or do you have to make render pass?
Oh, yeah, right. So if you're like, are you meaning if you plan to go to a compositing software after the fact?
Yeah, just, this is a stylized things, but do you think this will work with realistic style? For movie, for example, with the fur, class simulation, all these things?
Yes, with more work, of course. Like, so our approach to Unreal Access is it's on a project basis. Like we use Unreal, we're in a project where it feels like it's going to be a benefit or it feels like it's going to give us some saving. Because we have a pipeline for hyper-realistic stuff, we don't always want to use Unreal for that because we have something that works. And when you're doing realistic stuff with Unreal, a lot of the work to get to there is the time savings are sort of put elsewhere to like get that look. It can work. It is a lot more work though, and yes, you can output render passes from Unreal to then take to Nuke. But in my opinion, you lose some of the benefits of working with Unreal when you do a post-composite pass because the fun of Unreal is that you have in camera. You have your final image in camera. Otherwise, you're kind of like losing some of that joy if you're then taking it out and compositing and putting it more into a VFX workflow. So yes, totally possible, but I guess it really depends on what you're wanting from Unreal. At that point, you're essentially just getting the faster renders. So yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. It's recorded, so you can watch it again.
These questions may be not completely related, but do you think it's worth it to spend a little bit of computation, like on heavy nodes, for example, in Unreal, instead of reworking the UVs, or spend more time on something else, like, for example, word align textures or functions that help for the texturing phase?
I mean, again, project depends on what you're going for. If you're working on a game, for example, like if you want to work on something where it needs to be truly real time, like 30 frames, 60 frames a second, maybe better doing the textures, because like at that point every little helps. But when you're doing a render replacement, the difference between using like a node for projections that might be a little bit more expensive than the textures, cumulatively is not going to be that great of a difference. We're never going to notice the difference whether something's like 1.1 second a frame versus 1.3, because it's still very fast. So I would say, depending on what you're doing, it's definitely like an option. Like in the case of this, we would take the heavier node rather than like the sort of longer fix, because ultimately at the end of the day, we are still working towards frames as our final image, and just the 2D image is the end result, not like an interactive experience. So within reason, yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, hello. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing.
Thank you.
I have a question about you collaborating with another studio for the animation part.
Yeah.
Is it because of the strict deadlines, or just because Axis is doing like the main animation and the background animation is done by another company?
Yeah, so it's mainly like a scheduling thing. So at Axis, the way we take projects is we have quite a lot of projects running at once, and sometimes we don't always have the teams available for projects, and that sometimes means we can't take them. But in this case, we were able to take the project and work with a studio that Riot had previously worked with for animation, which let us achieve that, just because we had our real-time team available, but maybe not the team of animators available at the time. And in addition, we'd worked with this studio before, because again, as both being like partners with Riot, you have these people that you can collaborate with to make these trailers.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks for coming. You mentioned that you actually investigated Material X. I'm not sure how deep you went into Material X.
Early days.
Early days. Okay, my question is pretty much like going around, like, is there something missing there that you would like us to working on and those kind of stuff? What would be the first few things that comes to your mind?
I mean, for Material X, I'm definitely a little more in the dark. So for full context, we are looking at more at the USD side right now. Like the Material X has not really yet been a substantial part of our investigations. Again, I'm not sure if it's fully supported, but like I think it's ultimately making sure that it can tie in and get the benefits of the material network in Unreal that comes over to other pipelines. Because again, when you lose that, that's for me the sort of sad point. Like when I see that in certain cases where you maybe in Unreal where you can sort of like tile a texture to sort of get that sort of density. Instead, things become baked, and you sort of lose that ability to maybe as a camera moves away, you change the sort of frequency of scaling and all of these sort of interactive procedural elements that you have in the material network. If that can work in tandem with Material X, then it would be like amazing. Cool. Well, if anyone has any more questions, again, you know where to reach me. I'll be here tomorrow. I'll be here Thursday, and I'd love to talk to any one of you about this, Axis, or animation in general. But yeah, honestly, thank you.